What up guys, Miguel here from Yugatech. So Huawei recently released their 2019 P series late March. And while everybody's eyes are focused on that periscope lens the Pro model has, we cannot deny the fact that the standard P30 should have what it takes to stand up to the standard S10, right? Well, let's figure it out here in our full camera comparison of the Huawei P30 versus the Galaxy S10. For hardware, at the back of both devices you get a triple camera setup. The P30 utilizes a 40 megapixel 27mm wide lens with an aperture rating of f1.8, followed by a 16 megapixel 17mm ultra wide with an aperture rating of f2.2, and lastly an 8 megapixel 80mm telephoto with an aperture rating of f2.4. For the S10 on the other hand, you get a 12 megapixel 26mm wide with a variable aperture of f1.5 to 2.4. Next, a 16 megapixel 12mm ultra wide with an aperture rating of f2.2. And lastly, a 12 megapixel 52mm telephoto with an aperture rating of f2.2. At the front, both devices are utilizing a single lens setup. The P30's is a 32 megapixel wide with an aperture rating of f2.0. The S10's is a 10 megapixel 26mm wide with an aperture rating of f1.9. Alright, for hardware on paper, it's a tie. We must all know by now that hardware is only half the story. We've seen the Pixel phones take the throne for best smartphone cameras and countless other reviews solely because of software and overall usability. But before that, let's talk about features. The Huawei P30 may not have its big brother's periscope lens or the fourth time-of-flight camera, but it isn't the end of the world. I mean, it is still a Leica partnered product after all. Notable features for the P30 include an ISO capable of up to 204,800, a dedicated 3x optical zoom, a 5x hybrid zoom, a 30x digital zoom, laser autofocus, optical image stabilization for the telephoto lens, a dual LED dual tone flash, Leica optics, and that sweet P-series night mode. The S10 on the other hand features dual pixel autofocus for both the wide and the selfie camera, optical image stabilization for both wide and telephoto, and auto HDR. On the video side of things, the P30 can shoot 4K at 30 frames per second, 1080p at 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second, and 720p at 30 frames per second. The S10 can shoot 4K at 60 and 30 frames per second, 1080p at 60 and 30 frames per second, and 720p at 30 frames per second. This is all with the stock camera app, by the way. For the front camera, both the P30 and the S10 can shoot at Quad HD, Full HD, and HD at 30 frames per second. For slow-mo video recording in Full HD, both devices can shoot up to 240 frames per second slow motion. You can also go up to 960 frames per second slow motion in high definition. Alright, so we're finally here. Let's take a look at some sample photos and figure out our overall winner. Quick disclaimer, the samples we'll be using are for general use and modes, which means no pro mode or modes that both phones do not share, just to keep things as fair as possible. In this first low-angle photo, I honestly think that they both look great. Buildings on both photos look sharp and color reproduction at first glance is on point. Now let's check out the same shot on the ultra-wide lenses of both devices. Now here we can see the slight difference in the color reproduction of both devices. The P30's photo seems to be a bit warmer compared to the S10's. Also, the S10's ultra-wide lens has a wider field of view compared to the P30's. Moving on to this quick shot I took of Ira and Ali in the elevator, we can see that the P30's shot looks a tad bit more washed out compared to the S10's. Next up, another quick shot, this time of Joey. I wouldn't be surprised if your eyes were more drawn to the P30's photo. It looks more dramatic and ready to post for social media. I do find that the S10's colors look way more faithful to what I saw in real life. Now, let's talk about dynamic range and post-processing a little bit more. I do want to mention that at this point, AI is turned on for both devices. I usually keep AI turned off, but I found that the AI processing on both devices aren't so aggressive in the first place, so let's keep them on. Alright, first up is this photo I'm really fond of. It's a busy scene which makes it perfect for this. So we already know that the P30's photos look warmer due to its post-processing. Now, if you check the shadows in the P30 shot, they seem darker, giving the photo an overall more dramatic look. In terms of dynamic range, I do think that the S10 handled this better. From the sun peeking through the trees to the color of the sky, there is an obvious gradient change to the blue sky as it gets to the center of the shot. The P30 seems to have blown out the sky a bit more, and the rays from the sun through the leaves are more visible on the S10. Looking at the bottom left corner of both photos, I do think that the P30 was able to retain more detail there. In this next shot, I find the S10 looks way more appealing from the get-go. The edges of the building and the phone lines look way sharper, and you might be thinking that the blacks are crushed here when comparing to the P30's shot. But I do believe they are equally great photos. The difference is in the post-processing. The P30's shot is a bit more under-contrasted compared to the S10's, so it might make photos of people look more dramatic, but it just makes this photo look like someone slapped an Instagram filter on it. Dynamic range is excellent here from both devices. If we zoom into the jet in the sky, it just looks as it should. Now, in this ultra-wide shot, you can better see the warmer tone from the P30. The S10 also handled the highlights way better. Here's a better example of how the P30 treats its highlights as opposed to its shadows. The P30 completely overblows the highlights, thus losing detail from the light shade, which you can see better on the S10. Alright, let's move to the night mode category. Huawei's P series has made this a must-have dedicated mode for most smartphones today. Being able to virtually see in the dark by keeping your smartphone's camera shutter open for a few seconds and keeping as still as possible. Basically, a long exposure shot for all you photographers out there. This is where the S10 might be at a slight disadvantage. You see, the S10 doesn't have a dedicated night mode you can use by command. Samsung's AI Scene Optimizer has to recognize the scene as a night mode shot for it to work. And, well, that's just kind of disappointing. Hopefully, Samsung will make it part of the dedicated modes in the future via a software update. In this first shot we have of Ira, it's around 6:30 in the evening when this was taken. This scene was not dark enough for the S10's night mode to activate, but I wanted to see the difference between the P30 standard shot and with the night mode turned on. So with night mode turned on, the image looks brighter and the contrast levels up a notch. You can also clearly see that here as I switch between the P30 standard photo and the night mode photo. You can also notice that the night mode shot fixes the overblown light on the wall. Okay, let's get more serious with this night mode action. The next set of photos are with night mode turned on across all devices. These shots were taken at around 1:30 in the morning. There was a subtle red light shining on a portion of the leaves of this tree. I was actually quite surprised with how the S10 handled these photos. Obviously, the P30 did a way better job here overall. But there is one thing I want to mention in favor of the S10. The color reproduction. It's still more faithful on the S10. The P30 seems to oversaturate the colors for some reason. The night I took these shots, we just happened to have a OnePlus 6T with us too. Here's what the 6T's shot looked like with Nightscape on for reference. Okay, this next shot is taken on the same night with absolutely no light at all directed at the scene. Both shots kinda look blurry, that's due to me not being completely still, but wow! This shot just confirms that, yes, the P30 can see in the dark. The S10 is barely hanging on at this point, but again, the colors are still more faithful on the S10. The 6T on the other hand is quietly following behind the S10. For this next one, damn! The S10 didn't do horribly, but the P30 is just on another level when it comes to its night shots. These shots were taken at around 5 in the morning. The P30 makes it look like it's about to become 6 in the morning. Introducing the Pixel 3's night sight for reference. And the S10 is now in 3rd place. In this next shot, let's have all three right off the bat. Okay, so the S10 had some trouble here with the highlights, causing flares. And the image looks like the shadows were pulled up a bit in post-processing. For this shot, I actually think that the Pixel 3 did the best here. Okay, yes, the P30 is the brightest of the bunch and probably the most detailed in that regard, but I feel like something happened in post here. The buildings on the left look like they could have been photoshopped in. It's like there's this drop shadow behind them, and I found that weird. Okay, let's now move on to portrait mode. So in this portrait of Joey, you can again see the post-processing difference we talked about earlier. But the S10 did do a better job of separating the background from the subject here. You can see it when we zoom into his hair and his right forearm. In terms of subject-background separation, they're pretty neck and neck here. It all comes down to which colors you prefer. With this one, the P30 separated the background from the subjects better compared to the S10. But I do like the color from the S10 more. The blacks just look way too crushed for me here on the P30. It is also worth mentioning that on the S10, you can change or edit the blur and the bokeh after the photo is taken. On the P30, you cannot. Let's brush through zooming real quick. We all know which phone is gonna get wrecked in this segment. The basis for this is to figure out which device retains more detail as we keep zooming closer and closer. In this first set of photos, we start off from both devices ultra-wide to 1x, then to 2x. For the S10, 2x is optical, while for the P30, it's digital. You can also clearly see that the yellow of the crane seems more vibrant on the S10, while the blacks for the P30 are more deep. Next, okay, starting off again from the ultra-wide, then 1x, 2x, you're starting to see the green tint post-processing from the P30 a bit more, as compared to the S10's punchy colors. 3x, this is now digital for the S10 and optical for the P30. It also seems like that green tint isn't as obvious on this lens. 5x, hybrid for the P30, digital for the S10. Now, 10x. The S10 is now in grainy watercolor territory, and the P30 is still just about keeping it together. This is the maximum zoom length for the S10. For the P30, we can go up to 30x. It's definitely not the clearest and sharpest thing, nonetheless, it's impressive to see how far you can zoom with it. Okay, before we move on to selfies, I know earlier I said that we weren't comparing modes that both phones don't share, but I do want to mention the super awesome super macro mode on the P30. It's crazy how close you can get to a subject and retain focus. Check out some quick samples right now. So for selfies, starting off with the standard mode, under good lighting, both devices look great. I do prefer the way my eyes and hair look on the S10, but what about in poor lighting conditions? Well, I do think I look better on the P30 for this one, but oddly, the P30 doesn't get a screen flash for the selfie camera unlike the S10, which does help a bunch. Moving on to selfie portrait mode. So in this shot, it seems like the P30 overblew the highlights way more than the S10. The S10's shot also looks sharper here, although neither of them handled the subject background separation perfectly, especially when it comes to hair. In this next shot with better lighting, I again do prefer the S10's shot here. The way highlights are represented on my face, eyes, and hair is just something I prefer on the S10. Not to mention the P30 kinda gave me a haircut when separating the background from myself. Lastly, let's take a look at video. This is a 4K video sample from Gamescom, and I'm actually quite impressed with both devices. The P30's post-processing carries over here as well, giving its footage a warmer tone. I do think that the S10 stabilization is slightly better here than the P30's. But yes, they both look pretty good for 4K smartphone recording. Now, let's take a look at some 1080p footage at 60 frames per second. In terms of picture quality, the P30 seems to look a bit more hazy and is really having trouble keeping up with the fluidity of the S10. There could be a number of things at play here, but my bet is that the S10's 60p footage has a higher bitrate compared to the P30's. Drop that frame rate down to 30p and my first impression is that the P30's post-processing is kinda making the footage look a bit more dull and flat compared to the S10's. But I think overall, picture quality is on par here. Moving to some Slowmo video. So first up, we're checking out 240 frames per second Slowmo footage at 1080p. I think it's amazing how you're able to capture such footage out of something you keep in your pocket all day. The trick to Slowmo footage, of course, is to shoot with the most light you can get. And the S10's image quality takes the cake here. Finally, let's get to that 720p 960 frames per second super Slowmo. Honestly, I can't see myself using this feature a lot, especially because of its resolution. but I do think the S10 does this better. Because for some reason on the P30 when shooting 960 frames per second slow-mo, you can't seem to change the in and out points of the footage after it's been shot. Which I don't understand because you can do just that when it comes to 120 or 240 frames per second slow-mo footage. Now when it comes to selfie video, I do feel like that both devices are on par here too. I'm not too bothered by the P30's post-processing here, and I actually kinda like it. But the stabilization of the P30 is weird. As I move the phone around, there seems to be some warpage going on, and I'm definitely not a fan of that. Now this was a true dogfight in my opinion. But for me personally, I do prefer the S10 overall. I just am not a fan of the P30's post-processing and I for one am somebody who likes to edit photos after I've captured them. And I definitely wish that the S10 could have a dedicated night mode that could compete with the P30's. That is not to say that the P30's camera system is bad. I do think that the P30 Pro does overshadow the P30 a lot, which honestly sucks. Because the standard P30 is quite a capable camera phone too. And just be honest with yourself. What are you gonna do with a 50x zoom in the first place? Are you gonna be taking pictures of the moon all day, all night? Or are you just a pervert? Well, whatever. Tell me, which do you guys prefer, the P30 or the S10? Let us know in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smack that like button, subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit that bell icon so you get notified of our future uploads. Be sure to visit yugetech.com for the latest tech news and reviews. Again, this has been Miguel, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!